Captain Blackheart was once the most feared pirate on the seven seas, his laughter as legendary as his sword. But when his beloved wife Isabella died in his arms during a storm 3 years ago, that laughter died with her. His crew now speaks in whispers around their silent captain, afraid to disturb the grief that has turned him into a ghost of his former self. The man who once commanded respect through charisma now rules through cold silence and hollow stares. Then comes Sophia, a spirited young woman with eyes like emeralds and a tongue sharp enough to cut through the thickest fog. She boards his ship not as a prisoner, but as someone who refuses to be intimidated by his reputation or his sorrow. But what happens when the woman who fears nothing meets the man who has forgotten how to feel anything? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the deck of the Crimson Revenge, once the most vibrant ship to sail the Caribbean waters. Her red sails, which had once billowed proudly like the wings of some magnificent seabird, now hung limp and faded, their color drained to the pale pink of dried blood. The ship herself seemed to mourn alongside her captain, every plank and rope bearing the weight of unspoken sorrow. Captain Marcus Blackheart stood at the bow, his weathered hands gripping the rail with the same intensity he had once reserved for his cutlass. His dark hair, streaked with premature silver, whipped in the salt-laden breeze, but his eyes remained fixed on the horizon, with the vacant stare of a man who had lost his way. The thick gold chain around his neck caught the light, revealing the simple wedding band that rested against his heart, Isabella's ring, worn thin by 3 years of his restless fingers. Behind him the crew moved about their duties with the practiced silence of men who had learned not to disturb their captain's grief. Miguel Santos, the grizzled first mate whose loyalty had never wavered through 30 years of storms and battles, approached with careful steps. His weathered face bore the map of countless adventures, but his eyes held a sadness that matched the morning mist. "Captain," Miguel said softly, his voice barely above a whisper, "the men are asking about our next port. We're running low on fresh water and supplies." Blackheart did not turn around. He rarely spoke anymore, communicating through gestures and cold stares that had become his language of command. He raised one hand and pointed southwest, toward the merchant routes that would yield the easiest prey. It was the same gesture he had made for months now, leading them from one meaningless raid to another. Miguel nodded and turned to relay the orders, but paused when he noticed something different in his captain's posture. For just a moment, Blackheart's fingers had moved to touch the ring beneath his shirt, and Miguel caught the faintest tremor in those usually steady hands. The crew remembered when their captain's laughter had been as fearsome as his reputation. Marcus Blackheart had been a giant among pirates, not just for his skill with a blade or his cunning in battle, but for the joy he brought to the dangerous life they all shared. His voice had once carried across the water like thunder, inspiring fear in enemies and fierce loyalty in his men. Now that same voice had been silenced by a grief so profound that it seemed to have infected the very soul of the ship. 3 years ago, during the worst storm any of them had ever witnessed, Isabella Blackheart had breathed her last breath in her husband's arms. She had been the heart of the Crimson Revenge, the gentle force that had civilized their rough crew without breaking their pirate spirits. Her death had torn something fundamental from their captain's chest, leaving behind a hollow man who went through the motions of leadership while his heart lay buried in the Caribbean depths alongside his beloved wife. The younger crew members, those who had joined after Isabella's passing, knew their captain only as the Silent Death, a spectre who commanded through fear rather than respect. But the older hands remembered the man he used to be, and they grieved not just for the woman they had lost, but for the captain who had died with her. As the day wore on, Blackheart maintained his vigil at the bow, as unchanging as the North Star. The sun climbed higher, beating down on the deck with relentless intensity, but he seemed immune to its heat. His mind dwelt in the past, in memories of laughter and love that felt as distant as the stars themselves. The Crimson Revenge cut through the waves with mechanical precision, her crew performing their duties with the efficiency born of long practice. They had learned to read their captain's moods in the set of his shoulders, the tilt of his head, the way his hands moved across the ship's rail. Today those signs spoke of the same hollow resignation that had consumed him for 3 long years. But change was coming to the Crimson Revenge, though none aboard could have predicted its form. Somewhere ahead in the bustling port of Nassau, a young woman with fire in her eyes and rebellion in her heart was making plans that would alter the course of every soul aboard the legendary pirate ship. The ghost ship sailed on, carrying its crew of the walking wounded, toward a destiny none of them could imagine. The port of Nassau bustled with the controlled chaos of commerce and piracy existing in uneasy harmony. Merchants hawked their wares alongside smugglers, while respectable ships anchored next to vessels flying the black flag. In this world of moral ambiguity, Sophia Merchant had grown up learning to navigate both the literal waters of the Caribbean and the treacherous currents of her father's business empire. Standing on the balcony of her father's mansion, Sophia clutched her father's ornate compass, its brass surface worn smooth by generations of merchant men who had used it to navigate the dangerous waters of both the sea and commerce. The compass had been her grandfather's, then her father's, and now, though he would never admit it, it should have been hers. But Richard Merchant, despite his daughter's obvious aptitude for navigation and business, remained stubbornly convinced that a woman's place was in marriage, not on the deck of a ship. Sophia, her father's voice boomed from the study below, carrying the particular edge that meant he was about to deliver news she would not wish to hear. Come down here at once. She descended the mahogany staircase with measured steps, her emerald silk dress rustling softly against the polished wood. At 23, Sophia possessed a beauty that was both striking and dangerous, with auburn hair that caught fire in sunlight and eyes the color of deep ocean waters. But it was her mind that made her truly formidable, sharp as any cutlass, and twice as quick. Richard Merchant stood behind his massive desk, a map of shipping routes spread before him like a battle plan. At 55, he had built his fortune through a combination of legitimate trade and carefully orchestrated smuggling operations that kept him just on the right side of respectable. His graying beard was perfectly trimmed, his clothes impeccable, but his eyes held the calculating gleam of a man who had learned to profit from other people's desperation. "Sophia, my dear, I have wonderful news," he said, though his tone suggested he expected resistance. "Lord Hamilton has formally requested your hand in marriage." Sophia's fingers tightened on the compass until its edges bit into her palm. Lord Hamilton was a pompous English aristocrat, with soft hands and softer morals, who saw her as nothing more than a pretty ornament to grace his estate back in London. "Father, we've discussed this. I have no intention of marrying Lord Hamilton or anyone else you've selected for me." Richard's face darkened. "You will marry Hamilton, and you will do so within the month. The arrangements have already been made." "The arrangements can be unmade," Sophia replied with the cool authority of someone accustomed to getting her way through intelligence rather than submission. "I have other plans for my life." "Your plans?" Richard laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "What plans could you possibly have? You're a woman, Sophia. Your purpose is to marry well and provide your husband with sons." Sophia stepped closer to the desk, placing her hands flat on the map that showed the shipping lanes she knew better than most captains, twice her age. "My purpose is to live my own life, make my own choices, and sail my own course. You taught me navigation, Father. You taught me to read the wind and the waves. Did you think I would be content to sit in some English parlor and embroider cushions for the rest of my days? I taught you those things as a diversion, not as preparation for some impossible fantasy. The sea is no place for a lady. Tell that to Anne Bonny. Tell that to Mary Read. Tell that to the dozens of women who have made names for themselves on these waters." Richard slammed his hand down on the desk, causing the compass to jump. "Those women were pirates and criminals. Is that what you aspire to become?" Sophia smiled, and there was something in that expression that would have given her father pause if he had been paying closer attention. Perhaps it is, father. Perhaps that's exactly what I aspire to become. That night, as the household slept and the port settled into the relative quiet of the small hours, Sophia made her choice. She packed light, a few changes of clothes, her mother's jewelry, and most importantly, her father's compass. She left behind a letter explaining her decision and her refusal to live the life he had planned for her. The Crimson Revenge lay at anchor in the harbor, her faded red sails folded like sleeping wings. Sophia had heard the stories, knew the legends of Captain Blackheart and his crew of deadly cutthroats. She also knew that they would be sailing with the morning tide. Swimming silently through the dark water, she reached the ship's hull and climbed aboard with the skill of someone who had spent years exploring every vessel in her father's fleet. The night watch was lazy, more concerned with their rum than with potential intruders. By the time the sun rose, Sophia Merchant was far from Nassau, hidden in the hold of the most feared pirate ship on the Caribbean Sea. The sun had climbed well above the horizon when Sophia was discovered. She had managed to remain hidden in the ship's hold for nearly 6 hours, curled between barrels of salted pork and coils of spare rope, listening to the familiar sounds of a ship getting underway. The creaking of timber, the snap of sails catching wind, the rhythmic splash of waves against the hull, these were the sounds of freedom to her ears. It was Thomas Red O'Malley who found her, a scraggly pirate with arms like ship's rope and a beard the color of rust. He had come below decks, searching for a particular bottle of rum, when he noticed the green silk fabric peeking out from behind a water barrel. "Well, I'll be keel-hauled," he muttered, then raised his voice. "Captain, you'd better come see this." Within moments, heavy footsteps thundered down the wooden stairs. Sophia emerged from her hiding place with as much dignity as she could muster, brushing dust from her dress and lifting her chin defiantly. She found herself facing not just Red O'Malley, but Miguel Santos and 3 other crew members, all staring at her with expressions ranging from astonishment to alarm. "What in Neptune's name is a lady doing in our hold?" Miguel demanded, his weathered hand instinctively moving to rest on the pommel of his cutlass. Before Sophia could answer, another set of footsteps descended the stairs, slower, more deliberate. The crew immediately stepped aside, creating a path for their captain. Sophia felt her breath catch as Captain Blackheart emerged from the shadows above. He was taller than she had expected, with broad shoulders that filled the narrow space between the ship's ribs. His dark hair was tied back with a leather cord, revealing a face that would have been handsome if not for the emptiness in his eyes. Those eyes, grey as a winter storm, fixed upon her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken, though whether from fear or fascination, she could not say. For a long moment, neither spoke. The crew watched in tense silence, waiting to see how their unpredictable captain would react to this unprecedented situation. In the old days before Isabella's death, Blackheart might have laughed at the audacity of it. Now, his face remained as impassive as carved stone. "I am Sophia Merchant," she said finally, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "I wish to join your crew." Red O'Malley snorted with laughter. "Join our crew? Lady, do you have any idea what sort of ship this is?" "I know exactly what sort of ship this is," Sophia replied, without taking her eyes off Blackheart. "The Crimson Revenge, captained by the most feared pirate in the Caribbean. I also know that you need someone who can read the stars, navigate by compass, and speak 3 languages fluently." Miguel stepped forward, his expression skeptical. "And what makes you think a merchant's daughter would possess such skills?" Sophia reached into her dress and withdrew her father's compass, its brass surface gleaming in the lamplight. "This compass has guided merchant ships through these waters for 3 generations. I learned navigation before I learned to embroider, and I can plot a course through any waters in the Caribbean." Blackheart's eyes moved to the compass, then back to her face. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, rusty from disuse. Why? The single word carried more weight than 100 questions. Why had she left her comfortable life? Why risk everything to join a crew of cutthroats and murderers? Why choose the dangerous uncertainty of pirate life over the secure future her father had planned? Because, Sophia said, meeting his gaze without flinching, a cage is still a cage, even when it's made of gold and silk. I would rather die free on these waters than live as a prisoner in some English lord's parlour. Something flickered in Blackheart's eyes, so brief that Sophia might have imagined it. Recognition, perhaps, or the ghost of understanding. He studied her for another long moment, taking in her determined stance, the way she held herself like someone prepared to fight for what she wanted. Finally he turned to Miguel. Give her Quinn's old hammock. Put her to work in the galley. The crew exchanged shocked glances. Miguel opened his mouth to protest, but Blackheart was already heading back toward the stairs. Captain, Miguel called after him. Are you certain about this? A woman aboard ship. Blackheart paused at the bottom of the stairs, his hand on the wooden rail. Without turning around, he spoke just loud enough for them all to hear. She stays. And with that, Sophia Merchant officially became the newest and most unlikely member of the Crimson Revenge's crew. Over the following days, Sophia threw herself into shipboard life with the determination of someone who had burned all bridges behind her. She scrubbed at decks until her hands were raw, helped Cookie prepare meals that bore little resemblance to the delicate cuisine of her father's table, and learned to tie knots that would hold fast in the strongest gales. The crew watched her with a mixture of curiosity and grudging respect. She never complained about the work, never asked for special treatment, and proved surprisingly adept at tasks that would have challenged men twice her size. Even Red O'Malley, who had initially been the most vocal opponent of having a woman aboard, began to acknowledge her worth when she successfully predicted a change in weather that allowed them to avoid a dangerous squall. But it was Captain Blackheart who remained the greatest mystery. He moved through the ship like a ghost, giving orders through gestures and brief words, never acknowledging Sophia's presence beyond the practical necessities of command. She found herself studying him from the corner of her eye, trying to glimpse the man who lay buried beneath all that grief. It was Miguel who finally told her the story, 3 nights into her voyage, as they sat on deck during the evening watch. The older pirate had initially been suspicious of her motives, but her willingness to work and her obvious skill at navigation had gradually won him over. She was not like other women, Miguel said, his voice soft with memory as he gazed out at the moonlit waves. Isabella, I mean, when the captain first brought her aboard, we thought he had lost his mind. A Spanish nobleman's daughter, captured during a raid on a merchant vessel bound for Cartagena. Sophia listened intently, grateful for any insight into the enigma that was Marcus Blackheart. She was supposed to be ransomed back to her family, Miguel continued. But something happened during that voyage. She saw past his reputation, past the fear that others felt when they heard his name. And he became a different man around her. Different how? Miguel smiled, his weathered face transforming with the memory. He laughed. God, how he laughed. The sound would carry across the water like music, and his crew would work twice as hard just to hear it again. Isabella brought out the best in all of us, but especially in him. She civilized us without taming us, if you understand what I mean. Sophia nodded, beginning to grasp the magnitude of what Blackheart had lost. They were married right here on this deck, with the entire crew as witnesses. I had never seen the captain so happy, and I never saw Isabella looking anything but radiant. For 7 years, she sailed with us, turning this ship from a vessel of war into a home. What happened to her? Miguel's expression darkened. The storm came out of nowhere. We had encountered rough weather before, but this was different. Like the sea itself had turned against us. The waves were mountains of water, and the wind howled like all the demons of hell. We lost 3 good men that night. And Isabella, he paused, struggling with the memory. She fell ill with fever during the worst of it. Some sickness she had picked up in port, perhaps, but the storm made everything worse. The captain stayed by her side for 3 days, holding her hand, talking to her even when she could no longer respond. When she died, something in him died with her. Sophia felt tears prick her eyes as she imagined the scene. And he has not spoken since? Oh, he speaks when he must. Miguel corrected. Commands, orders, the necessities of running a ship. But the laughter, the joy, the man we knew that all went into the grave with Isabella. That night, unable to sleep in her cramped hammock, Sophia found herself wandering the ship. She discovered a small cabin that had obviously belonged to a woman, delicate curtains at the porthole, dried flowers in a ceramic vase, and books in both Spanish and English arranged neatly on wooden shelves. On the small writing desk, she found Isabella's diary, its leather binding worn soft with handling. She opened it carefully, not intending to pry, but unable to resist the glimpse into the life of the woman who had captured a pirate's heart. The entries were written in a flowing hand, full of observations about life at sea, affectionate mentions of crew members, and tender references to my beloved Marcus. But it was one passage, dated just weeks before Isabella's death, that made Sophia's breath catch. "I fear sometimes that Marcus loves me too much, that his happiness depends too greatly upon mine. I pray that if something should happen to me, he will not let grief consume the beautiful spirit that first drew me to him. He has so much love to give, so much joy to share with the world. I only hope that someday, should I not be there to receive it, he will find another worthy of the treasure that is his heart." The storm struck without warning on Sophia's 5th day aboard the Crimson Revenge. She had been working in the galley when the ship suddenly lurched violently to starboard, sending pots and pans crashing to the floor in a symphony of clanging metal. Cookie, the ship's grizzled cook, grabbed her arm with surprising strength. "Storm coming, lad. Best get yourself secured somewhere safe. These Caribbean squalls can turn deadly faster than you can say your prayers." But Sophia had grown up around ships and sailors. She knew that all hands were needed during a storm, regardless of gender or experience. She made her way topside, fighting against the increasingly violent motion of the ship, and emerged onto a deck that had transformed into chaos. The sky had darkened to the color of old pewter, and rain lashed the deck in horizontal sheets driven by winds that howled like banshees. The crew worked frantically to secure loose rigging and take in sail, their movements practiced despite the treacherous conditions. Lightning split the sky with blinding brilliance, followed by thunder that seemed to shake the very bones of the ship. Through the storm's fury, Sophia saw Captain Blackheart standing near the wheel, his coat whipping around him like black wings. But there was something different about his posture, a rigidity that spoke of more than just the need to maintain balance on the pitching deck. His face was turned upward toward the storm, and even through the rain and spray, she could see that his eyes held a look of raw terror. Miguel appeared beside her, shouting to be heard over the wind. "Stay below. This is no place for..." His words were cut off as a massive wave crashed over the bow, sending torrents of seawater cascading across the deck. When the water cleared, Sophia saw that Blackheart had moved to the rail, his hands gripping the wood so tightly that his knuckles showed white even in the storm's grey light. Understanding struck her like a physical blow. This was not just any storm. This was the anniversary of Isabella's death, and the tempest had triggered memories that were tearing him apart from within. She could see it in the way he stood, in the haunted expression on his face, in the way his lips moved as if he was speaking to someone who was no longer there. Against Miguel's protests and her own better judgment, Sophia fought her way across the slippery deck toward her captain. The ship rolled heavily to port, and she grabbed the nearest rope to keep from being thrown overboard. When she reached Blackheart, she saw that he was indeed speaking, his words torn away by the wind, but clearly audible to her. "I'm sorry, Isabella. I should have protected you. I should have sailed us away from the storm. I should have..." "Captain," Sophia called out, but he did not hear her over the tempest roar. She reached out and touched his arm, feeling the tremor that ran through his body. When he turned to look at her, she saw a broken man reliving the worst night of his life. His eyes were wild, unfocused, seeing not the woman before him, but the ghost of his beloved wife dying in his arms, while the storm raged around them. "She's not here," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Isabella's not here, and it's my fault. I let her die. I let the storm take her." Sophia felt her heart break for this man who had been carrying such crushing guilt for 3 long years. Without thinking, she stepped closer, placing both hands on his arms and forcing him to focus on her face.
"Marcus," she said, using his given name for the first time, Isabella's death was not your fault. Storms are acts of nature. They cannot be controlled or predicted with certainty. You did everything you could. But Blackheart was lost in his memories, his breathing coming in short, panicked gasps. Around them the crew continued their battle against the storm, but Sophia's entire world had narrowed to this one tortured man who was drowning in guilt and grief. The ship pitched violently again, and Blackheart stumbled. Sophia caught him, surprised by her own strength as she helped steady him against the rail. For a moment, he leaned against her, and she felt the full weight of his sorrow pressing down upon them both. "I hear her calling me," he said, his voice broken. "In every storm I hear Isabella calling my name." Lightning illuminated the deck again, and in that brief, brilliant moment, Sophia saw tears mixing with rain on Blackheart's face. She had never seen a man look so completely lost, so utterly destroyed by love and loss. "She's not calling you to join her," Sophia said firmly, her voice cutting through the storm's chaos. "She's calling you to live." The storm began to ease as suddenly as it had begun, but the damage to Marcus Blackheart's carefully constructed walls had already been done. 3 days after the storm, the Crimson Revenge encountered trouble of an entirely different nature. Sophia was on deck helping to mend sails when the lookout's cry rang out across the water. "Sail ho! 3 points off the starboard bow." Miguel raised his spyglass, studying the approaching vessel with practiced eyes. His expression grew grim as he lowered the instrument and turned to Captain Blackheart, who had emerged from his cabin at the commotion. "It's the Venganza, Captain. Rodriguez is flying his colors." Even Sophia, new as she was to pirate politics, had heard the name whispered among the crew. Captain Diego Rodriguez commanded one of the most vicious pirate crews in the Caribbean, and his hatred for Marcus Blackheart was legendary throughout the islands. Blackheart's jaw tightened as he took the spyglass from Miguel and studied the approaching ship. The Venganza was a sleek Spanish galleon, painted black as midnight and bristling with cannons. Her reputation for brutality was matched only by her captain's personal vendetta against the man who had once humiliated him in front of half the pirates in Tortuga. "What are your orders, Captain?" Miguel asked, though his hand was already moving toward the signal flags that would alert the crew to prepare for battle. For a moment, Blackheart seemed to consider their options. They could run, but the Venganza was known for her speed. They could fight, but Rodriguez had twice their firepower and a crew drunk on bloodlust. Or they could try to outmaneuver their enemy, using the coral reefs that dotted this stretch of water to their advantage. "Ready the guns," Blackheart said quietly, his voice carrying clearly across the deck despite its low volume. "But hold your fire until I give the word." The crew sprang into action with the efficiency of men who had faced death countless times before. Cannons were loaded, cutlasses sharpened, and pistols primed. Sophia found herself swept up in the preparations, helping to move gunpowder and shot from the ship's magazine to the gun deck. As the Venganza drew closer, Sophia caught sight of Captain Rodriguez himself standing at his ship's bow. He was a tall, lean man, with a carefully groomed beard and eyes like chips of black obsidian. Even at this distance, she could see the cruel smile that played about his lips as he anticipated the coming battle. "Why does he hate Captain Blackheart so much?" Sophia asked Red O'Malley as they carried ammunition to the stern chasers. "Old rivalry," Red replied, his voice tight with tension. "Goes back near 15 years. Rodriguez challenged the captain to single combat over some insult. Can't remember what exactly. Captain beat him fair and square, but Rodriguez claimed foul play. Been nursing a grudge ever since." The distance between the ships continued to close. Sophia could now make out individual crew members on the Venganza's deck, their weapons glinting in the afternoon sun. The Spanish pirates were clearly confident of victory, some of them already gesturing obscenely toward the Crimson Revenge. But Captain Blackheart had not built his fearsome reputation through reckless confrontations. As the enemy ship approached firing range, he suddenly barked out a series of orders that sent his crew scrambling to adjust the sails and change course. The Crimson Revenge turned shortly to starboard, heading directly toward a section of water that looked deceptively calm. "He's running,"
Someone shouted from the Venganza's deck, and Rodriguez's laughter carried across the water like the cry of a hunting hawk. The Spanish ship gave chase, her captain eager to finally claim his revenge. But Blackheart was leading them into a trap that only a man with intimate knowledge of these waters could have conceived. Hidden beneath the placid surface lay a coral reef, its razor-sharp edges capable of tearing the hull out of any ship, unlucky enough to strike them. The Crimson Revenge, with her shallower draft and experienced crew, slipped through the narrow channel like a knife through silk. Behind them, the Venganza followed blindly, her captain too focused on his approaching triumph to notice the danger. Sophia watched in fascination as Blackheart orchestrated their escape with the precision of a master tactician. His orders were calm and measured, each command delivered with the quiet authority that had made him a legend among pirates. For the first time since she had come aboard, she caught a glimpse of the man he must have been before grief had dimmed his fire. The trap was sprung with devastating efficiency. The Venganza struck the reef with a grinding crash that could be heard across the water, her hull tearing open like paper. Rodriguez's curses echoed across the waves as his ship began to list heavily to port, taking on water through the gaping wound in her side. "Shall we finish them, Captain?" Miguel asked, his hand hovering over the signal to fire. Blackheart studied the sinking ship through his spyglass, watching as Rodriguez's crew struggled to keep their vessel afloat. After a long moment, he shook his head. "Let the sea judge them," he said simply, and turned away from the sight of his enemy's defeat. Word of the Siren's Pearl came to them through the loose network of tavern keepers, smugglers, and corrupt harbor masters, who served as the Caribbean's unofficial intelligence system. The crew was drinking in a ramshackle establishment called the Drunken Mermaid, when a weathered old salt named One-Eyed Pete approached their table with the air of a man bearing valuable information. "I hear you boys are always looking for a good score," Pete said, settling his ancient bones onto a creaking wooden stool. His single eye gleamed with the particular avarice that came from knowing someone else's secret. "Got something that might interest Captain Blackheart?" Miguel leaned forward, his scarred hands wrapped around a pewter mug of rum. "We're listening, old man, but it better be worth our time." Pete glanced around the smoky tavern, ensuring they wouldn't be overheard, then pulled a rolled piece of parchment from inside his tattered coat. The paper was yellowed with age and stained with what might have been blood, tea, or both. "The Siren's Pearl," he whispered, unrolling the document to reveal a crude but detailed map. "Been chasing legends of this beauty for near 40 years, but I'm getting too old for treasure hunting, and my bones tell me it's time to pass the torch." Sophia studied the map with the keen eye of someone trained in navigation and cartography. The coastlines were accurate, the depth soundings precise, and the astronomical calculations in the margins showed a level of knowledge that impressed even her well-educated mind. "What makes this pearl so special?" she asked, noting the intricate symbols and warnings scattered across the parchment. Pete's eye fixed on her with something approaching reverence. "They say the Siren's Pearl ain't just a treasure, miss. It's got power over the very seas themselves. Storms obey it, sea monsters serve it, and the man who possesses it can command the waters like Neptune himself." Red O'Malley snorted with skepticism. "Sounds like sailors' tales and rum-fueled fantasies to me." "Does it?" Pete challenged, producing a second, smaller piece of parchment. This one bore an official seal and was written in the formal Spanish of colonial administrators. "This here's a report from the governor of Puerto Rico to the Spanish crown, dated 1687. Read it yourself." Sophia took the document and translated aloud, her voice growing more intrigued with each line. "The pearl in question appears to possess properties that defy natural explanation. During our attempts to study it, 3 separate storms arose from clear skies, all ceasing the moment the artifact was returned to its protective casing. Additionally, several species of sea life, including creatures of unusual size, were observed gathering near our research vessel." She looked up from the document, her emerald eyes bright with excitement. "This is extraordinary. If even half of this is true, then it's the find of a lifetime. Miguel finished, his own skepticism beginning to waver. Pete nodded sagely. The Pearl's been in the same family for generations. The Vasquez clan, rich Spanish merchants who've kept it hidden away in their mansion on San Miguel Island. They think their high walls and private guards can protect them from men like us. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Captain Blackheart himself. The tavern seemed to grow quieter as he approached their table, his presence commanding attention even in his current diminished state. He studied the map with those storm-grey eyes, and Sophia found herself holding her breath as she waited for his decision. "The risks?" Blackheart asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Pete shrugged. "The usual armed guards, treacherous waters, and half the Spanish Navy patrolling those waters since word got out about increased pirate activity. Plus, there's talk that other crews are sniffing around the same prize." Sophia leaned forward, unable to contain her enthusiasm. "Captain, I know those waters. My father's ships have traded in that region for years. I can navigate the reefs and shoals that would stop larger vessels, and the astronomical calculations on this map. I can verify their accuracy and help plot the optimal approach." For a moment, something flickered in Blackheart's eyes. Not quite interest, but perhaps the ghost of the curiosity that had once driven him to seek out the most challenging prizes the Caribbean had to offer. "The Vasquez family," Sophia continued, her mind racing with possibilities. "I know that attended several of their social gatherings. With my father. The mansion's layout, their security procedures, their daily routines. I could get us inside." Miguel and the other crew members exchanged glances. They had seen their captain go through the motions of leadership for 3 years, but this was the first time since Isabella's death that he seemed to be genuinely considering a challenge worthy of his legendary reputation. Blackheart studied the map for another long moment, then looked directly at Sophia. "You would steal from people you know. I would steal from people who would see me married off like a broodmare to strengthen their business connections," she replied without hesitation. "The Vasquez family represents everything I'm running from. Wealth used to control rather than liberate, power wielded to suppress rather than inspire." The captain nodded slowly, and for the first time since she had known him, Sophia thought she detected the faintest hint of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. The vault was everything Sophia had promised and more. Hidden behind the portrait of Don Carlos's stern-faced grandfather, the heavy iron door swung open to reveal a chamber filled with treasures that represented generations of Vasquez family wealth. Gold coins from across the Spanish Empire gleamed in neat stacks, precious gems caught the lamplight like trapped stars, and artifacts from the New World spoke of conquest and plunder on an imperial scale. But it was the Siren's Pearl that drew every eye in the room. The legendary artifact rested in a place of honor at the chamber's center, housed within an ornate silver reliquary that seemed to pulse with its own inner light. The pearl itself was larger than Sophia's fist, its surface shimmering with colors that seemed to shift and flow like living water. As they approached, she could swear she heard something, a sound like distant singing carried on an ocean breeze that existed only in her mind. "Mother of God," Miguel whispered, crossing himself reflexively. "It's beautiful." Blackheart stepped closer to the reliquary, his weathered hands hovering over the silver casing as if he were afraid to touch it. In the pearl's luminescent glow, his face looked younger somehow, touched by wonder in a way Sophia had never seen before. "The map spoke true," he said quietly. "I can feel the power radiating from it." But their moment of triumph was shattered by the sound of footsteps in the corridor outside. Sophia's blood turned to ice as she recognized the measured pace of Don Carlos Vasquez himself, accompanied by at least 2 other men. Her mind raced. The Don was supposed to be attending a governor's dinner in the capital, not wandering his mansion at midnight. "Hide," Blackheart commanded in a voice barely above a whisper. But the study offered little in the way of concealment for 6 grown men. The sound of voices grew closer, and Sophia could make out Don Carlos speaking in rapid Spanish to his companions. The guards reported seeing a ship in the cove. The Don was saying, "If there are pirates on my island, I want them found and dealt with immediately." Sophia's heart hammered against her ribs as she pressed herself behind a heavy wooden cabinet. Blackheart beside her, so close that she could feel the warmth of his body and hear his controlled breathing. The other crew members had scattered to whatever hiding places they could find, but she knew it would only be a matter of moments before they were discovered. The study door swung open, and lamplight spilled across the floor as Don Carlos entered with 2 armed guards. Sophia held her breath, watching through a gap in the cabinet, as the Spanish nobleman surveyed his private domain with the suspicious eyes of a man who had not built his fortune by being careless. "Everything appears to be in order, Don Carlos," one of the guards said, his hand resting casually on the pommel of his sword. "Check the vault," Don Carlos ordered, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience. Sophia felt Blackheart tense beside her as the guard approached the hidden panel behind the portrait. In seconds their theft would be discovered, and with it, any hope of escape. Her mind raced through possibilities, but every scenario ended in capture or bloodshed. Then, in a moment of desperate inspiration, she stepped out from behind the cabinet. "Uncle Carlos," she said, in perfect Spanish, her voice carrying just the right mixture of surprise and embarrassment. "I didn't expect you to return so early." Don Carlos spun around, his eyes widening as he took in the sight of his old friend's daughter standing in his private study in the middle of the night. "Sophia, what in heaven's name are you doing here?" "I needed somewhere private to think," she said, moving closer to draw his attention away from the vault. "Father wants me to marry Lord Hamilton, and I came here hoping you might speak with him on my behalf. You've always been like family to us." The Don's expression softened slightly, though suspicion still lingered in his dark eyes. "Child, you cannot simply break into people's homes because you're having difficulties with your father. How did you even get onto the island?" "I borrowed one of Father's boats," Sophia replied, the lie flowing smoothly from her lips. "I know it was wrong, but I was desperate. Please, Uncle Carlos, you know what kind of man Hamilton is. Surely you wouldn't want to see me married to such a creature." As she spoke, she could see Blackheart and the others taking advantage of her distraction to move closer to the windows. Her heart pounded as she realized that their escape depended entirely on her ability to keep Don Carlos focused on her family drama rather than the open vault behind him. "We will discuss this in the morning," Don Carlos said finally. "Maria will prepare a guest room for you, and tomorrow we will send word to your father." "Thank you, Uncle," Sophia said, moving toward him, with arms outstretched as if to embrace him in gratitude. As she did so, she caught Blackheart's eye and gave the slightest nod toward the window. The escape from San Miguel Island became a desperate flight through treacherous waters as the Spanish Navy gave chase at first light. Sophia had managed to slip away from the Vasquez mansion during the confusion of the night, but not before Don Carlos discovered the theft of his most prized possession. Now 3 warships pursued the Crimson Revenge across the crystalline waters of the Caribbean, their cannon fire echoing like thunder across the waves. "They're gaining on us," Miguel reported from his position at the stern, spyglass trained on their pursuers. "The Santa Maria's got the wind advantage, and she'll be in cannon range within the hour." Sophia stood beside the wheel, her hands gripping her father's compass as she guided them through a maze of coral reefs that would have challenged even the most experienced navigator. The ancient map had proven its worth once again, revealing passages between the razor-sharp coral formations that were invisible to anyone unfamiliar with these particular waters. "Hard to starboard," she called out, her voice cutting through the wind and spray. "There's a channel between those 2 reefs that will take us into deeper water." Blackheart worked alongside his crew with an energy that reminded them all of the man he used to be. For the first time in 3 years, genuine purpose animated his movements as he barked orders and adjusted sail trim with the precision of a master mariner. The Siren's Pearl, secure in a leather pouch at his waist, seemed to pulse with power that matched the rhythm of his heartbeat. As they navigated the treacherous passage, Sophia found herself working in perfect synchronization with the captain. Where she called out course corrections, he anticipated the sail adjustments needed to maintain speed. Where he spotted potential hazards, she had already calculated alternative routes. It was as if they had been sailing together for years rather than weeks. "You're enjoying this," she said during a brief lull in the navigation, noting the way his eyes had regained some of their old fire. "I had forgotten," Blackheart replied, his hands steady on the wheel as they crested a particularly large wave, the feeling of being truly alive. The pursuing warships were forced to reduce speed as they entered the reef system, their deeper drafts making navigation far more dangerous. One vessel, the San Salvador, struck coral and was forced to drop out of the chase entirely, her crew working frantically to patch the hole in her hull. But their troubles were far from over. As they emerged from the reefs into open water, a new threat appeared on the horizon: the black sails of Rodriguez's remaining ships, somehow having survived their earlier encounter, and now positioned to cut off their escape route. "It's a trap," Miguel said grimly. "Rodriguez must have made a deal with the Spanish. He drives us toward their guns while they prevent us from reaching open water." Sophia studied the tactical situation with the analytical mind her father had trained in matters of commerce and strategy. They were caught between two enemies, with limited options for escape. But as she examined her compass and compared their position to the markings on the ancient map, she noticed something that made her pulse quicken with excitement. "Captain," she said urgently, "do you trust me?" Blackheart turned those storm-grey eyes toward her, and she saw something in them that hadn't been there before, not just recognition of her skills, but genuine faith in her judgment. "With my life," he said simply, "then follow my heading exactly, no matter how dangerous it seems. The map shows something here that the Spanish charts don't mark, a passage that shouldn't exist, but apparently does." As she spoke, she pulled her mother's sapphire necklace from beneath her shirt, the precious stones catching the sunlight like captured pieces of the sea itself. The necklace had been in her family for generations, a symbol of the noble blood that flowed in her veins despite her father's merchant origins. "I need you to know something," she said as cannon fire from the approaching warships began to splash dangerously close to their stern. "My mother died when I was 12. She was caught in a storm while sailing to meet my father in Port Royal. For years I blamed the sea for taking her from me. And now," Blackheart asked, his voice gentle despite the chaos surrounding them, "now I understand that the sea doesn't take, it transforms. My mother didn't die in that storm. She became part of something larger, something eternal. Just as Isabella didn't simply die, she became part of you, part of this ship, part of the wind that fills our sails." For a moment, despite the danger and the sound of approaching cannon fire, Blackheart smiled, not the ghost of a smile she had glimpsed before, but a real expression of joy that transformed his entire face. The passage Sophia had found on the ancient map led them through a narrow channel between two towering walls of black volcanic rock, so close that the crew could reach out and touch the stone faces on either side. The water here was deep and still, protected from the wind by the natural barriers that rose like cathedral spires toward the sky. As they emerged into a hidden lagoon, Sophia gasped at what lay before them. The siren's pearl in Blackheart's pouch had begun to glow with an intensity that was visible even in the bright Caribbean sunlight, and the waters of the lagoon responded to its presence with phenomenon that defied all natural explanation. Schools of tropical fish swam in perfect formation around their ship, their scales flashing silver and gold in patterns that seemed almost like language. Dolphins appeared from the depths, leaping and diving in synchronized displays that spoke of intelligence far beyond mere animal instinct. Most remarkably of all, the water itself seemed to be singing, a low, haunting melody that resonated through the hull of the Crimson Revenge and into the very bones of her crew. "Captain," Red O'Malley called out, his voice tight with a mixture of awe and fear, "look at the water." The lagoon's surface had begun to glow with the same ethereal light as the pearl, creating patterns that swirled and shifted like living art. Where the ship's wake disturbed the water, luminescent trails followed in their path, marking their passage with lines of pure radiance. Blackheart drew the siren's pearl from its pouch, and immediately the effects intensified. The singing grew louder, more complex, as if an entire choir of sirens was welcoming them to this sacred place. Fish of every size and color gathered around the ship in such numbers that the water seemed to boil with life. "It's responding to you," Sophia said, moving closer to study the pearl's reaction. The legends were true. This isn't just a treasure, it's a key to power over the ocean itself. But even as wonder filled their hearts, danger was approaching. The sound of cannon fire echoed from the narrow passage behind them, growing louder as their pursuers discovered their hiding place. Rodriguez's ships had found the entrance to the lagoon, and the Spanish warships would not be far behind. "We're trapped," Miguel said grimly, scanning the lagoon for alternative escape routes. The towering rock walls seemed to offer no exit, save the way they had come. Sophia studied the pearl's glow, noting how it pulsed in rhythm with the movements of the sea life around them. An idea began to form in her mind. Dangerous, unprecedented, but perhaps their only hope of survival. "Captain," she said urgently, "I think the pearl can do more than just attract sea creatures." The ancient texts spoke of sirens commanding great beasts of the deep. What if those weren't just stories? Blackheart looked at her with growing understanding. "You think it can summon something larger?" "I think it already is." Even as she spoke, the water in the center of the lagoon began to churn and bubble. Something immense was rising from the depths. Something that had slumbered in the dark waters for centuries, waiting for the pearl's call. The crew watched in stunned silence as tentacles thicker than ships' masts broke the surface, followed by a head the size of a small house. The kraken that emerged from the lagoon's depths was a creature of legend, made manifest, ancient, intelligent, and possessed of a power that dwarfed anything in the Spanish fleet. Its eyes, each larger than a man, fixed upon the siren's pearl with what could only be described as recognition. "Madre de Dios," Miguel whispered, crossing himself as the massive creature regarded them with obvious intelligence. But Sophia felt no fear as she looked into those ancient eyes. Instead, she sensed curiosity, even benevolence. This was not the mindless monster of sailors' tales, but a guardian of the deep places, a keeper of secrets, older than human civilization. "It's not going to hurt us," she said with growing confidence. "It recognizes the pearl's authority." Blackheart held the artifact higher, and the kraken's response was immediate. It sank lower in the water, its massive head dipping in what could only be interpreted as a bow of acknowledgement. The sound of splintering wood echoed across the lagoon as Rodriguez's lead ship forced its way through the narrow passage, her hull scraping against the volcanic rock. Behind her, two more vessels struggled to follow, their captains desperate to claim the bounty they believed waited in the hidden lagoon. But they had no idea what they were sailing into. Sophia placed her hand over Blackheart's as he held the pearl, and together they felt the creature's vast intelligence touch their minds. Images flashed between them, ancient oceans, civilizations lost beneath the waves, and the responsibility that came with wielding such power. "We need to end this," Blackheart said quietly. "Not just for us, but for everyone who might seek to abuse what we've found." The kraken's response was swift and decisive. The kraken's attack on Rodriguez's ships was swift and merciless. Tentacles the size of ancient oak trees wrapped around the hulls of the pursuing vessels, lifting them from the water as easily as a child might pick up toy boats. The screams of the Spanish sailors echoed across the lagoon as their ships were crushed like eggshells in the creature's grasp. But Sophia felt no satisfaction in their enemy's destruction. Instead, she found herself overwhelmed by the magnitude of the power they now commanded. The pearl pulsed in Blackheart's hands like a beating heart, its light growing brighter as the kraken responded to their unspoken commands. "Stop," she said suddenly, placing her hand firmly over the pearl. "This isn't what Isabella would have wanted." Blackheart looked at her with surprise, but as their eyes met, understanding passed between them. The man Isabella had fallen in love with was not one who would use power to destroy without mercy. He was better than that, and Sophia's words reminded him of who he truly was beneath all the grief and anger. "Release them," Blackheart commanded, his voice carrying across the water with authority that somehow reached the ancient creature's consciousness. "Let them swim to shore." The kraken paused, its massive head turning toward them with what might have been confusion. For a moment, Sophia feared that the creature would not obey, But then, slowly, the tentacles loosened their grip on the broken ships, allowing the surviving sailors to struggle toward the rocky shores of the lagoon. Captain Rodriguez himself clung to a piece of floating debris, his face a mask of rage and disbelief as he watched his fleet destroyed by forces beyond his comprehension. When his eyes met Blackheart's across the water, the hatred there was so intense that it seemed to burn like a physical flame. "This isn't over, Blackheart," Rodriguez shouted, his voice hoarse with salt water and fury. "I'll see you dead for this." But his threats seemed hollow now, reduced to the impotent rage of a man who had discovered that there were powers in the world far greater than his own ambition. The Spanish warships that remained outside the lagoon withdrew quickly once they saw the fate of Rodriguez's vessels. Word of what had happened would spread throughout the Caribbean within days, adding new layers to the legend of Captain Blackheart and his mysterious female companion. As the immediate danger passed, Blackheart carefully returned the Siren's pearl to its protective pouch. The Kraken sank back into the depths of the lagoon, its ancient eyes watching them until the last moment before it disappeared beneath the luminescent water. "That was the right choice," Sophia said quietly, her hand still resting on his arm. "Was it? Those men will return with larger fleets, more weapons. We could have ended the threat permanently, and in doing so we would have become the very monsters that people already believe us to be." Sophia turned to face him fully, her emerald eyes reflecting the pearl's residual glow. Isabella's diary spoke of a man with a beautiful spirit, someone who chose love over fear, mercy over vengeance. "That's the man she fell in love with, Marcus. That's the man I'm falling in love with." The words hung in the air between them, like a bridge across the chasm of grief that had separated Blackheart from the world of the living. For a moment he seemed unable to breathe, his face cycling through emotions too complex to name. "Sophia," he began, but she pressed her fingers gently to his lips. "I know you think you're betraying her memory by caring for me, but love isn't betrayal, Marcus. It's the greatest tribute we can pay to those we've lost. Every moment of joy we experience honors their memory by proving that the love they gave us was not wasted." Miguel and the crew worked quietly around them, giving their captain and the remarkable woman who had transformed their world the privacy this moment demanded. They had all seen the change in Blackheart over the past weeks, the gradual return of the man they had once followed with fierce loyalty. "I don't know how," Blackheart said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to love someone again without fearing I'll lose them." "The same way you learned to love Isabella," Sophia replied. "One day at a time, one moment at a time, with faith that whatever time we have together is worth the risk of losing it." As if in response to their words, a gentle breeze filled the Crimson Revenge's sails, carrying them toward the lagoon's entrance and the open sea beyond. The hidden sanctuary had served its purpose, revealing truths about power, responsibility, and the courage required to love in a world full of loss. Behind them, the waters of the lagoon settled into peaceful stillness, as if the ancient guardian of the depths was satisfied with what it had witnessed. The test of the Siren's pearl had been passed, not through the demonstration of power, but through the wisdom to use that power with restraint. 3 days later, as the Crimson Revenge sailed through calm waters toward the pirate stronghold of Tortuga, Captain Rodriguez struck back with the desperate fury of a man who had lost everything. He had survived the Kraken's attack by clinging to wreckage and swimming to a merchant vessel that picked him up half dead from exposure. But his hatred had sustained him through his ordeal, and now he commanded a motley fleet of cutthroats and mercenaries united only by their desire for revenge against Marcus Blackheart. The attack came at dawn, when the morning mist still clung to the waves and visibility was limited to a few hundred yards in any direction. Rodriguez had learned cunning from his previous defeats, and this time he approached silently, using the weather to his advantage. Sophia was the first to spot the enemy ships emerging from the fog, like ghosts materializing from another world. She stood at the bow, her father's compass in one hand and the other shading her eyes as she peered through the grey half-light of early morning. "Ships approaching from 3 directions," she called out, her voice cutting through the peaceful morning air like a blade. "It's Rodriguez, and he's brought friends." The crew of the Crimson Revenge responded with the practiced efficiency of men who had faced death countless times, but there was something different in their movements now. They worked with the coordinated precision of sailors who had complete faith in their captain's ability to see them through any crisis. Blackheart emerged from his cabin already dressed for battle, his legendary cutlass Heartbreaker hanging at his side. The weapon had earned its fearsome reputation during countless boarding actions, its blade having tasted the blood of dozens of enemies who had underestimated the man who wielded it. For 3 years the sword had remained in its scabbard, unused and nearly forgotten as its owner retreated into grief and shadow. But now, as Blackheart drew the curved steel and felt its familiar weight in his hand, both man and weapon seemed to come alive with renewed purpose. "They want the pearl," Blackheart said, his voice carrying clearly across the deck despite its quiet intensity. "Rodriguez thinks that by taking it from us, he can command the same power we wielded in the lagoon. Can he?" Miguel asked, checking the priming on his pistols as enemy ships closed the distance. Sophia shook her head, her fingers instinctively moving to touch the siren's pearl, where it rested in the leather pouch at Blackheart's waist. "The pearl doesn't grant power. It reveals the power that was already there. Rodriguez has always been driven by hatred and greed. That's all the pearl would amplify in him." The first cannon shot split the morning air, as Rodriguez's flagship, a captured Spanish galleon painted black as midnight, opened fire on their starboard beam. The Crimson Revenge shuddered under the impact, but her sturdy construction held against the bombardment. "Return fire," Blackheart commanded, and his crew responded with enthusiasm born of absolute loyalty. The ship's guns roared in unison, sending iron death screaming across the water toward their attackers. But Rodriguez had learned from his previous encounters with the legendary pirate. This time, he had brought overwhelming force. 5 ships to Blackheart's 1, with crews that outnumbered the Crimson Revenge's complement by more than 3 to 1. As the battle raged around them, Sophia found herself fighting alongside the man she had come to love with a ferocity that surprised even her. She had never held a weapon in anger before boarding the pirate ship, but desperation and determination proved excellent teachers. When a grappling hook caught the Crimson Revenge's rail and enemy pirates began swarming aboard, she stood back to back with Blackheart, a cutlass in her hand and fire in her eyes. The blade felt natural in her grip, as if she had been born for this life of danger and freedom. "You fight well for a merchant's daughter," Blackheart said during a brief lull in the combat, admiration clear in his voice. "I'm not a merchant's daughter anymore," Sophia replied, parrying a thrust from an attacking pirate and responding with a cut that sent the man tumbling back into the sea. "I'm a pirate's woman, and pirates protect what they love." The battle reached its climax when Rodriguez himself swung across from his flagship, his own blade seeking Blackheart's heart with the precision of a man who had spent years dreaming of this moment. The two captains faced each other on the blood-slicked deck of the Crimson Revenge, their crews forming a circle around them as if by unspoken agreement. "You should have died with your precious Isabella," Rodriguez snarled, his sword weaving deadly patterns in the morning air. "But don't worry, I'll make sure you join her soon enough." The mention of Isabella's name triggered something primal in Blackheart, awakening the lethal warrior who had once been the most feared pirate captain in the Caribbean. The duel between Blackheart and Rodriguez was a thing of deadly beauty. 2 master swordsmen locked in combat that would have impressed the finest fencing masters of Europe. Steel rang against steel as they fought across the deck of the Crimson Revenge, their blades catching the morning sunlight in flashes of silver fire. Rodriguez was skilled, his technique polished through years of practice and refined by countless battles. But Blackheart fought with something more than skill. He fought with the passion of a man who had found his reason for living again. Every parry, every thrust, every defensive maneuver spoke of renewed purpose and the fierce desire to protect what he had almost lost. "You're slower than you used to be, old man," Rodriguez taunted as their blades locked at the hilts, both men straining against each other's strength. 3 years of grief have made you soft," "Perhaps," Blackheart replied, his voice calm despite the physical exertion. "But grief has also taught me what's truly worth fighting for." With a twist that would have done credit to a master swordsman half his age, Blackheart broke the blade lock and spun away, his cutlass describing a perfect arc that opened a thin line of red across Rodriguez's cheek. The Spanish pirate's eyes blazed with fury as he touched the wound, his fingers coming away bloody. Around them, both crews watched in tense silence, understanding that more than just two men's lives hung in the balance. This was a battle for the soul of piracy itself, between the old ways of mindless violence and a newer path that acknowledged honor even among thieves. As the fight continued, Sophia became aware of a strange sound cutting through the clash of steel and the shouts of the watching pirates. At first she thought it might be the wind in the rigging, or the distant call of seabirds, but as she listened more carefully, she realized it was something far more remarkable. Laughter, deep, rich, joyous laughter, that seemed to bubble up from some wellspring of happiness that had been buried but never destroyed. The sound was coming from Marcus Blackheart as he fought, and it transformed not just his face, but the entire atmosphere of the battle. The crew of the Crimson Revenge stared in amazement. It had been 3 years since they had heard their captain laugh, and the sound was like music after a long silence. Even some of Rodriguez's men paused in their own fighting, drawn by the infectious joy that seemed to radiate from the dueling pirate. "You hear that, Rodriguez?" Blackheart called out as he pressed his attack, driving his opponent steadily backward across the deck. "That's the sound of a man who remembers what it means to be alive." Rodriguez's response was a snarl of rage as he launched a desperate series of attacks, his blade seeking any opening in Blackheart's defense. But the Spanish pirate was fighting against more than just superior swordsmanship now. He was fighting against joy itself, against the power of love renewed and hope reborn. The ship's bell, which had remained silent since Isabella's death, suddenly began to ring. No one had touched the rope, but somehow the bronze bell pealed across the water, its clear notes carrying Blackheart's laughter to every corner of the battlefield. The sound had an extraordinary effect on everyone who heard it. The crew of the Crimson Revenge fought with renewed vigor, inspired by their captain's transformation. Even some of Rodriguez's men began to hesitate, questioning whether they truly wanted to destroy something so beautiful as the return of joy to a grieving man's heart. Sophia watched the duel with her heart in her throat, but she was not afraid. She could see the outcome written in the set of Blackheart's shoulders, the fluid grace of his movements, the way his eyes had regained the fire that had once made him a legend among pirates. The end came suddenly. Rodriguez, overextended in a desperate lunge, left himself open for just an instant. Blackheart's counterstrike was precise and merciful, a thrust that disabled rather than killed, sending Rodriguez's sword spinning across the deck to clatter harmlessly into the scuppers. The Spanish pirate found himself on his knees, Blackheart's blade at his throat, surrounded by the sound of his enemy's victorious laughter and the triumphant ringing of the ship's bell. "Finish it," Rodriguez gasped, his pride broken along with his sword arm. "Kill me and have done with it." But Blackheart stepped back, lowering his weapon with the gesture of a man who had moved beyond the need for vengeance. "No," he said simply, "you're not worth Isabella's memory, and you're certainly not worth interrupting my wedding plan." The last word rang across the deck like another peal of the ship's bell, and Sophia felt her heart leap with joy as she understood what he was truly saying. The wedding took place 3 days later at sunset, with the Crimson Revenge anchored in a secluded cove, surrounded by palm trees and white sand beaches that seemed to have been designed by nature herself for such a ceremony. The entire crew had worked tirelessly to transform the ship's deck into something worthy of the occasion, hanging lanterns from the rigging and weaving garlands of tropical flowers around every surface that would hold. Sophia stood at the ship's rail, wearing a gown that she had fashioned from silk salvaged from their various adventures, emerald green fabric that matched her eyes and caught the dying light like captured ocean waves. In her hair, She wore the pearls from her mother's necklace, their lustrous surface reflecting the warm glow of the setting sun. But it was the wedding rings that drew every eye, for they were unlike any jewelry ever seen in the Caribbean. Using the power of the siren's pearl, Blackheart had somehow transmuted base metal into gold that seemed to hold the very essence of the sea within its gleaming surface. The rings pulsed with a gentle inner light, as if they contained drops of the same luminescence that had filled the hidden lagoon. "Dearly beloved," Miguel began, his weathered face beaming with joy as he took on the unexpected role of ship's chaplain. "We are gathered here today to witness something that I, for one, never thought I'd live to see, our captain learning to love again." The crew of the Crimson Revenge stood in respectful silence, their usual rough demeanor replaced by something approaching reverence. These men who had followed Blackheart through storms and battles, who had watched him sink into the depths of despair after Isabella's death, now witnessed his resurrection with the awe of men who understood they were seeing a miracle. "Marcus Blackheart," Miguel continued, "do you take this woman to be your wife, to love and to cherish, through calm seas and rough weather, until death parts you?" Blackheart's voice, when he spoke his vows, carried clearly across the water with the strength and conviction that had once made him the most feared pirate captain in the Caribbean. But now that same voice was filled with tenderness rather than menace. "I do," he said, his storm-grey eyes never leaving Sophia's face. "I take Sophia not as a replacement for what I've lost, but as a new chapter in the story of my heart. Isabella taught me how to love, and now Sophia is teaching me that love doesn't end with death. It transforms, grows, and finds new ways to flourish." Sophia's own vows were spoken with the clear, precise diction of her refined upbringing, but her words carried the passion of a woman who had chosen adventure over safety, love over security. "I take you, Marcus, not despite your past, but because of it. Your love for Isabella doesn't diminish what we share. It proves that you're capable of the kind of deep, abiding devotion that most people only dream about. I'm honored to be the woman who gets to love you next." As they exchanged rings forged from the power of the sea itself, something extraordinary happened. The water around the ship began to glow with the same ethereal light they had witnessed in the hidden lagoon. Schools of dolphins appeared as if summoned by the ceremony, leaping and diving in joyous celebration around the anchored vessel. Even the weather seemed to acknowledge the significance of the moment. The sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson that rivaled the most elaborate cathedral windows, while gentle breezes filled the air with the scent of jasmine and frangipani from the nearby shore. "By the power vested in me by being the oldest member of this crew and the only one who can read Latin," Miguel announced with a grin, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. Captain, you may kiss your bride." The kiss that followed was witnessed not just by the crew of the Crimson Revenge, but seemingly by the ocean itself. As their lips met, the glowing water around the ship pulsed with increased intensity, and somewhere in the distance the haunting song of sirens could be heard. Not the deadly call that lured sailors to their doom, but a melody of celebration and blessing. When they finally parted, Blackheart rested his forehead against Sophia's, his hands cradling her face with infinite gentleness. "Hello, Mrs. Blackheart," he said softly, and his voice carried a happiness that 3 years of grief had not been able to destroy. "Hello, husband," she replied, and in that moment the transformation of Marcus Blackheart from broken widower to whole man was complete. The celebration that followed lasted well into the night, with rum flowing freely, and the crew taking turns sharing stories of their captain's legendary exploits. But throughout the festivities, the newlyweds remained the center of attention, not just because it was their wedding day, but because their love had somehow become a beacon of hope for everyone who witnessed it. 6 months after their wedding, the Crimson Revenge had become more than just a pirate ship. She had transformed into a floating legend that inspired hope throughout the Caribbean. Stories spread from port to port of Captain Blackheart and his remarkable wife, who used the power of the Siren's Pearl, not for conquest or destruction, but to protect the innocent and challenge the corrupt. They had rescued 3 merchant vessels from attacks by lesser pirates, returned stolen goods to their rightful owners, and even negotiated peaceful resolutions to conflicts that might otherwise have resulted in bloodshed. The crew had initially been skeptical of this new direction, but they found themselves taking pride in being part of something larger than mere piracy. Captain Blackheart stood at his writing desk in the cabin he now shared with Sophia, carefully recording their latest adventure in the ship's log. For the first time in years, he was documenting more than just navigation and weather. He was chronicling the rebirth of his soul and the growth of a love that had exceeded even his wildest hopes. "The waters off Martinique proved treacherous today," he wrote in his careful script, "but not because of reefs or storms. We encountered the slave ship Esperança, flying Portuguese colors and carrying 200 souls in conditions that would shame the devil himself." Sophia's tears at the sight of such suffering moved me more than any sermon ever could. "We freed those people and escorted them to safety in Dominica, where they can begin new lives as free men and women." Through the cabin windows, he could see his wife working with Miguel to teach some of the younger crew members the finer points of navigation. Her laughter carried across the deck, mixing with the natural sounds of wind and wave to create a symphony of contentment that still amazed him every time he heard it. The transformation in the crew had been as remarkable as his own. Red O'Malley had taken to reading books in his spare time, inspired by Sophia's extensive library of adventure novels and poetry. Cookie had learned to prepare meals that would have graced the finest restaurants in Port Royal. Even the newest members of their complement, refugees from other pirate crews who had sought them out after hearing the stories, carried themselves with a dignity that spoke of renewed purpose. But it was the letter that arrived that morning via a passing merchant vessel that truly marked the magnitude of the changes in their lives. Sophia had received word from her father, who had finally learned of her marriage and new life through the network of gossip that connected every port in the Caribbean. "My dearest daughter," Richard Merchant had written, "I confess that when I first learned of your unconventional marriage, I was prepared to disown you entirely. But the stories that reach me from every corner of our trading empire paint a picture of a woman who has found not just love, but purpose. If even half the tales are true, you and your husband have become the stuff of legend." The letter had continued with an offer that stunned both Sophia and Blackheart. A formal business partnership that would legitimize their operations while allowing them to continue their unique brand of maritime justice. Perhaps, her father had concluded, there is more than one way to build an empire worth leaving to one's children. The mention of children had caused both husband and wife to exchange meaningful glances. For that very morning, Sophia had shared news that would change their lives once again. She was carrying Blackheart's child, and the prospect of becoming a father filled him with a joy so profound that it seemed to radiate from his very soul. As evening approached and the crew settled into their usual routines, Sophia joined her husband in their cabin, her hand resting protectively over the slight curve of her belly. "Have you thought about names?" she asked, settling beside him at the writing desk and reading over his shoulder as he continued his log entries. "If it's a girl, Isabella, Sophia," he said without hesitation. "Isabella to honor the woman who taught me to love, and Sophia to celebrate the woman who taught me to love again. And if it's a boy." Blackheart smiled, his weathered features transforming with anticipation. "Marcus Richard Blackheart, after his grandfather, who may be a stubborn merchant, but who raised a daughter brave enough to steal away a pirate's heart." Outside their window, the Caribbean sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, while dolphins played in the ship's wake, and the gentle trade winds filled their sails with the promise of new adventure. The Siren's Pearl, secure in its place of honor in their cabin, pulsed with a gentle light that seemed to bless their growing family. The captain's log entry for that day would record fair weather, good winds, and smooth sailing. But between the lines, those who knew how to read such things would find the true story of love triumphant, hope restored, and the endless possibility that stretched ahead like the open ocean itself. The birth came on a night when the stars seemed to dance on the water and the Caribbean Sea lay as calm as a mirror, reflecting heaven itself. Sophia's labor had begun at sunset, and by the time the first light of dawn touched the horizon, the Crimson Revenge had welcomed its newest crew member into the world. Captain Marcus Blackheart held his daughter with hands that had once wielded cutlass and cannon, but now trembled with the overwhelming tenderness of new fatherhood. Isabella Sophia Blackheart was perfect in every detail, from her tiny fingers that gripped his thumb with surprising strength to the wisp of auburn hair that caught the morning light like spun gold. "She has your eyes," Sophia whispered from where she lay in their cabin, exhausted but radiant with joy. Grey as storm clouds, but with sunlight breaking through. The baby's first cry had echoed across the water, and something remarkable had happened. Every dolphin within miles had circled simultaneously, their joyous leaps creating fountains of spray that caught the dawn light like liquid diamonds. The crew, gathered on deck in respectful vigil, had watched in awe as the ocean itself seemed to celebrate the birth. Miguel, acting as the ship's unofficial physician, cleaned his hands and beamed with the satisfaction of a man who had successfully delivered his first baby. "She's healthy and strong, Captain. Got a good pair of lungs on her too, if that cry was any indication." The baby's rattle, crafted by the crew during Sophia's pregnancy, lay nearby on the cabin table. They had made it from pearls and gold, using techniques learned from watching Blackheart work with the siren's pearl. The tiny instrument caught the light and seemed to hum with its own inner music, as if it already knew the lullabies it would one day help sing. "Listen," Sophia said suddenly, her voice filled with wonder. Everyone in the cabin grew still, and in the silence they could hear it. The sound of laughter, not just Blackheart's laughter, though his joy certainly contributed to the chorus, but the laughter of the entire crew, echoing across the water as they celebrated on deck. It was a sound that would have been impossible to imagine 3 years ago, when grief had turned the Crimson Revenge into a ship of ghosts. But now, that same laughter seemed to call forth an answering joy from the sea itself. The water around the ship began to glow with the familiar ethereal light, and in the distance, the haunting songs of sirens could be heard. Not the deadly melodies of legend, but welcoming hymns that seemed to bless the newest member of their extraordinary family. "She's going to grow up thinking this is normal," Blackheart said with a chuckle, gently rocking his daughter as she settled into peaceful sleep. "Magical pearls, singing sirens, dolphins dancing in the wake. What kind of world are we giving her?" "A world where love conquers grief," Sophia replied, reaching out to touch her husband's face with infinite tenderness. "A world where the dead live on in the joy they inspire in the living. A world where a man can lose everything and still find the courage to love again." As if in response to her mother's words, baby Isabella opened her eyes, those storm-grey eyes that mirrored her father's, and seemed to look directly at the siren's pearl where it rested in its place of honor. The ancient artifact pulsed with gentle light, and for just a moment everyone in the cabin could swear they heard another voice joining in the celebration. It was soft and melodious, speaking words in Spanish that Sophia translated with tears in her eyes. "Bienvenida, pequeña Isabella. Tu mamá Isabella está muy orgullosa." "Welcome, little Isabella. Your mama Isabella is very proud." The presence faded as quickly as it had come, but its message was clear. The love that had existed between Marcus and Isabella had not been diminished by his love for Sophia. It had been transformed into something larger, something that could encompass and bless this new family without jealousy or sorrow. Outside on the deck, the crew continued their celebration as the sun climbed higher in the Caribbean sky. The ship's bell rang joyfully, its bronze voice carrying across the water to announce to anyone within hearing that the Crimson Revenge had gained a new soul, and somewhere in the depths below, ancient guardians of the sea smiled their approval at this newest chapter in the endless story of love, loss, and renewal. The siren's last laugh had become the first of many, echoing across the waves toward horizons bright with promise and adventures yet to come. In the gentle rocking of his ship and the peaceful breathing of his sleeping daughter, Marcus Blackheart had found something he thought he had lost forever, a future worth sailing toward.